So I'm Laura McInerney. I taught for 6 years in the east of London, and I'm currently a Fulbright scholar at the University of Missouri. My main focus is looking at free schools, but also charter schools in the US, what the difference is between the two, how we can learn from them. And I also write, blog, currently have a column for The Guardian in the Education Supplement. So charter schools are quite complicated. You've got 50 different states in the US, each of which has their own policy. The first state introduced it in 1993. Because the way legislation works in the US, it tends to change every year. So we're sort of looking at 20 years of now 43 states, often who've had maybe 20 different policies. So to say, how does it compare to the US is quite complicated. What's interesting is the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools publishes a set of laws each year, which are what they consider the best balance between transparency, accountability, innovation. And if you look at the UK in comparison to those, we do quite well on some things. So we're very autonomous, we allow lots of freedoms. The problem is, in terms of processes, we're not very transparent. Our oversight is a bit complicated. And areas that have really had that kind of setup have had a lot more fraud, a lot more problems in terms of finance. So it's not that we're some massive disaster, it's not that this is terrible. It's just a case of we've done some things really well, we could do some other things a bit better. The applications process is vital, that if you get it wrong, it does tend to lead to things further down the road being problematic. What's interesting is at the moment the government keeps saying, oh, it's got a lot better. It's definitely much better. But unfortunately we can't see any of the applications. We still know very little about how they're scored. We know very little about who's scoring them. So it's sort of all, in 5 years' time when none of these schools are failing, we'll prove to you that we got it right. And whilst I do believe, I'm sure that it has got better, it would feel, better from the public's perspective if we could know a bit more about it in advance. There is also a downside to making applications more complicated. So the US, for example, some states went through this and then they made it very, very difficult to apply. And that can constrain innovation. So it's not that I'm asking them to be suddenly very complicated in terms of the applications, but actually transparency is just a key and important part of that. So I think there's two elements to what is a really good thing that will come out of having applications open and more interest in the feedback on those. One is that it really enables other groups to advise. So currently we have New Schools Network who do a great job, but they can't help everybody. They have loads of specialist knowledge because they've seen several years of this route go ahead. It feels to me like if we had more groups that could step into the space, into that advisory space, who could learn from the past, then actually all schools that want to go ahead could be helped, and that would be a really good thing. The second thing that I think the openness and the transparency does is, it makes everybody think that little bit harder. If I know this is going to be out in public, then I want to make sure that I present it in the best possible light. I don't just dash it off and send it in. I don't just take up some civil servant's time with something spurious. I actually really think about what I'm doing. And for me, that's quite important. Transparency should encourage the right people to come forwards and make other people think a little bit more about it. I've spoken to free school applicants in the past who felt that they didn't understand why they were turned down in comparison to other people, and that's put them off. And these are really good head teachers who said to me, I could have done a really good job here, but I felt like there was something odd going on. I just feel like as citizens we're not in the best position if really good people are saying that they don't trust a system, and so that's, hopefully you would kind of move away from that. That would be a good thing. So one of the interesting things that's been kept very quiet by the government, and I don't know why, I'd be interested to know, is the Targeted Basic Need programme. So David Laws has mentioned it. They haven't mentioned it a lot. And money was put up in July to local authorities to open schools in areas of basic needs. So local authorities could compete and say, we need now a school in this area. They've been given some money. The local authority run the competition, and free school groups can be part of that decision as well. And then they send their preference to the Department for Education. The Department for Education sends back and says, yes, you can have this person, or actually we don't want you to have that person, we want to have this secondary person. Now that's interesting, because actually what that does is put the whole free school process, which goes through national government, back into the hands of the local authority. But keep some of the elements of open competition, free school providers, and proposal groups in there. Whether I think it's the best compromise we can come up with, I'm not 100% certain, but I certainly think it's an interesting thing to think about, and I'm glad that the government have realised that maybe a different strategy is needed for need rather than demand. Is less that the building itself is a problem and more the transitions. So where you've had these examples, I think there's currently a school that I read about, I can't remember where it is, where they've been in an office space for a couple of years and they're now about to be moved to an airport right next to a runway, and one expects that they won't stay there forever, they'll move again. Actually the transition is a big problem. So less the problem of being next to the airport, more the fact that you move from one school to the airport to somewhere else. It disrupts parent routines, it disrupts where your teachers are going to go, it influences things like teacher parking, whether or not everybody, if the teacher drops their child off on the way to school, can they now do that on a different route? And that causes quite a lot of problems. It's also financially very expensive to move, and there's a lot of implications of movement which people don't factor in. They've got to refurbish each time, they've got to pack things physically up, they've got to often change class sizes, and that has caused in the US in the past some of those schools to fold. That would be my concern from the financial school policy side of things. Obviously, would I want to send my child to a school without a playground? Probably not. But maybe these schools have other things to compensate as well. I mean, I taught in a school that had no fields, but then we had a park nearby and we used the park and we sent the students down to, do boats on the river. So you can have different ways of dealing with things. Yeah, I wouldn't want to say just because you have no playground you shouldn't open. It's a complicated question if you have a good school that is serving a good amount of the community, particularly if there aren't enough places elsewhere. So it might be that, okay, this school is now under, but it's doing better than another school, and actually there wouldn't be the capacity to take all of these students who are doing very well and place them all over, put them all over the show. I think what we probably need is a strategy in terms of financing and helping those schools to plan for different levels of engagement once we get a bit more of a handle on how likely it is that schools will open or close. And there do need to be decisions taken about how you spread that cost around. So if it's going to cost lots of extra cash to keep that school open, you really have to think through what the consequences are for that community of the money going there. But that is such a difficult one. There is no way of always knowing how that's going to go. So to bash the government for that one, I think would probably be slightly unfair. One of the complications in Britain around philanthropy and extra funding is that we often have an aversion to it on the basis of, if you go back sort of 80, 100 years in England, lots of provision in lots of social welfare areas, including hospitals and medicine and education, were charitably funded. That is a good thing because it brings more money in. The problem is it becomes very patchy. So suddenly you have one school that's getting lots of money from parents and another school that isn't. And immediately what we've done is made a disparity in something that will then carry through people's lives. So we have to say, well, what's more important? Is it just better that these children get something good? And it's kind of unfortunate that for the rest of their lives, these children who accidentally were in a place that didn't have the money are now going to carry that with them. Or do we disallow it and bring them down? Which would be the Toby Young argument, you're levelling down rather than bringing up. There isn't any one answer to that. What I will say is that there are free school models, for example, the 16 to 19 model. If you're going to open a free school 16 to 19 school, I would find it very difficult, having sat with founders, to open one of those sustainably with all of the resources that you need without finding some level of finance from elsewhere. So we may say, well, if all 16 to 19 schools are perhaps going to need to do this, it's not quite so problematic. But in essence, it comes back to this issue. Do you think that we should bring it in because it's a good thing, or do you think that we would be better off having equality and just dealing with what we've got? In terms of qualifications, I think it's important that if you have people coming in and they're on a training route, then you know that they are being observed, they're being mentored, they're being watched putting evidence together for their portfolio. You also know that they have met a minimum standards, so they have a degree. You know that they've got certain sort of standards in English and maths. You also know they're teaching across 2 key stages, that they've got a certain subject association. All sounds quite dull, but there's a lot of checklist and verification that comes with that. If you say we should have unqualified teachers, sure, that might mean someone brilliant walks in the door, or it might mean somebody terrible walks in the door and is allowed to stay there forever unchecked against certain standards that we think are important. If we're saying that some of these standards need flexibility, there is no reason why we cannot build flexibility in. So, for example, for a long time we wanted GCSE English and Maths, but then there were ways of getting equivalents for people who were training. That to me seems a sensible solution. So I'm not against flexibility in terms of the route by which you get qualified, whether some of the standards we can consider whether they're really fundamentally important. But you know, there are examples of cities in America which did this sort of liberalisation, and what you found was the most vulnerable pupils in the poorest areas soon became the ones with the least qualified teachers. And that's my concern and that's my worry. And I just think if you can have better qualified teachers, as people who are in an education profession, why wouldn't you do that? How can you say to your students, I think it's very important that you pass your qualification, but I'm not going to do that, I'm afraid. That's just not my thing. So that's my concern about it all. I suppose if you've got quite a small team and that's seen as not important and that you all just help each other regardless and that you have QTS but we don't consider you any better than anybody else, I can see how a school could manage that so it becomes irrelevant. I just think in a profession which is often about you attaining certain standards and certain achievements as you as a young person, I find that a really weird ethos. So it's not that I don't believe it can be done, I just wonder whether you're doing right in terms of modelling the best approach to learning that you could model for young people. There are dangers to balance on both sides here, and I think one of the problems is if you end up with a public service, bearing in mind that every single teacher is being paid for by the taxpayer and actually belongs to the whole country. They are a teacher who has largely often been trained by the taxpayer, certainly their degree will largely have been subsidised or to an extent paid for at one point. It's important that they're going to go out into the world and carry on being teachers. We're just going to assume that that's true. That they are able to talk quite freely and frankly about the job that they've done. And one of the things that would concern me about confidentiality clauses is not only that they couldn't talk about why they left, but I would be concerned if that meant that they couldn't talk about their teaching practice. Because being able to talk freely, share your resources, there are now academies and free schools which won't allow teachers to do that. I think that's incredibly dangerous for the profession as a whole, which is trying to help the country as a whole, who are all paying for it. So that's my concern. At the same time, I also understand that when you have very challenging schools that are just opening, that are going through quite a lot, that are getting a lot of negative press, which isn't always their fault, it's sometimes because other schools are failing and they've tried their best to do everything, it isn't helpful if you have people saying things that are incorrect. My argument would be if you have someone who's saying something inaccurate, factually inaccurate in the press, there are routes and ways of dealing with that. And given the extra resource that a lot of these schools have, given the extra help that they've had, given the extra attention from the government, it's not like they're really struggling to make a case or a fight against that. So I would want to know the reasons why they're putting the confidentiality clauses in. If they're specific individual cases where someone has been extremely difficult and you know that there's going to be something which is going to be very damaging to your students and it's one-off, or if this is about a systemic problem which could then affect the profession as a whole, and that becomes incredibly worrying. So with regional commissioners, it's really going to depend on how the whole model plays out. And one of the interesting things is we don't currently have a clear process by which a provider is chosen for a free school, a provider is chosen for an academy takeover. We don't have very clear processes on what should trigger the closure of a school. So my fear is if we allow 8 commissioners to suddenly arrive at the DFE on Monday morning one day and we don't have a clear process, we're going to have 8 people doing 8 random different things, and what you're going to have is someone in Luton complaining that somebody up in Liverpool has been treated completely differently in a country that's supposed to have one education legal structure. So I think there are some steps that we need to get through before we have 8 people randomly running around the country trying to do something that none of us really know what's supposed to happen. So So my understanding is that regional commissioners would be they would look over free schools and academies, and also then be part of this broker system whereby any failing maintained school would also be having a new provider selected in. And I think that's great. I think there should be someone, and it would be great if they had regional knowledge, and it would also be great actually if that person got the opinions of local people and the local authority, not on veto. Local people and local authorities should not always be the only selector of these things, but I think it would be great if they were able to do that. My fear is we have no clear understanding of how that process should work, and I get that each individual one is quite different. When you have a national process that says, look, each individual process is different, here's roughly the steps, but we're going to go through it, you can have those individual differences. 8 regional differences, and you're going to start causing yourself a headache. I would hope we get to a system whereby it just becomes very clear that we need new schools to open. That's a thing. We've been doing it for 100 years and we haven't always been that great at it. This is a brilliant opportunity to say, here are some clear processes for how we're going to open schools from now on. Here's some clear processes for when schools are going wrong. What we're going to do, we're going to bring in new people to look after them. If they're not working, we're going to close them down and we're going to encourage new competition to open new schools. I think all of that is fantastic, and I hope that lots of these free schools do really well, show that it can be done, that the chains, some of them grow and do a really good job, and that also that some of the local authorities have done a cracking job sort of fight back and say, look, we're doing a really good job. We want to be able to help in these ways. Let us help with these elements of it. Let us help give you advice on the competitions. Let us run some elements of this where that's a good thing for the local community. And so my hope is that basically we end up with a system where we can open and close schools as effectively as possible, with as minimum trauma for the children involved as possible, and that we just get really good at it. I would love everyone to look at England and be like, you're opening a school. Look how good England is at opening schools. Got a problem school. Look at England. See how they deal with that. Sometimes it means taking a new school over. Sometimes it means closing it down. But the way they deal with the students in those situations is the best. If we can get to that, then I'm happy with everything else.